Hello, my name is Dr. Treiber. I'm lecturer in neurocriminology at the University of Cambridge, and it's my pleasure to be able to interview my colleague, Professor Per Olof Wikstro, which we refer to as PO, much more familiarly. He is Professor of Ecological and Developmental Criminology, also at the University of Cambridge. He's also the Director there for the Centre of Analytic Criminology, and he's the Principal Investigator of the Peterborough Adolescent and Young Adult Development Study, known as PADS+, which I'm sure we'll be hearing about a little bit later today. He's internationally acknowledged. He has received the Cell and Gluck Award for his contributions to international criminology, something which we'll highlight. He has been awarded the Stockholm Prize for his contributions to criminological research. He's a fellow for the Center of Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences in Stanford. He's also a fellow of the American Society of Criminology and a fellow of the British Academy. His contributions to criminology, I feel, can be characterized by the concept of integration. And so that's how I want to try to capture this interview, using that theme of integration across looking at his history and his experience of criminology, which he's going to share with us today. So this includes the integration of knowledge, both knowledge that's relevant to, as well as specific to criminology, and also the integration of criminologists themselves, so bringing together criminologists from across the world, but also especially from Europe. He also has then taken this integration of knowledge and drawn from that key insights and integrated those, in particular integrating insights across individual and environmental perspectives in criminology, which have traditionally been kept separate. He also has moved beyond that to integrate theory building with theory testing, something that's at the core of his perspective of analytic criminology, which is something that he has been putting forward in very recent years. And finally, he has also been involved in integrating cross-national research as part of this theory testing, and then looking at the implications of this broad area of knowledge that he's helped bring together and also helped to create in terms of understanding the implications for explanation of crime as well as crime prevention. So I'm going to start off actually with just a little brief presse of how PO has actually integrated his work with that of an American neuropsychologist. That would be myself, so that it's understood where our relationship lies. I came to Cambridge in 2002, as I mentioned, having studied neuropsychology, so I was very interested in criminal psychology and the roots of criminal behavior. But I found actually it was very difficult to transition from the natural sciences into social sciences. And I think now, looking back and having had the perspective of my work with PO, I can understand that now because I was very interested in action mechanisms. I was interested in theory testing. These were things that I had connected with in my own studies in the more natural sciences. And I didn't find a home for them in criminology. And so I was very lucky, I think, to be in the right place at the right time, where PO was bringing this into criminology and making this the focus, again, of his analytic criminology. So I was very lucky to join the PADS+ study, which has been mentioned, and I've now been with that study for the past almost 20 years. So the rest is effectively history. We are, of course, most interested in PO's history, however, so that's where we're going to turn now. I mentioned about structuring this around the idea of integration, and so I have somewhat artificially segmented some of my thinking around the different periods that I'm familiar of in PO's life and the focus of integration that he was involved in those periods. So the first period is the period that he spent in Sweden before I ever was introduced to him. And this is a period where he was beginning his forays into criminology and integrating knowledge, both interdisciplinary knowledge, bringing together ideas from various disciplines, and I'm sure, Pia, you can say a lot about your background, which is very broad across different subjects, and also international, where he was doing quite a lot to bring together criminologists and their ideas from around the world. So can you please tell us first about this period of your life in Sweden and how you were integrating this interdisciplinary knowledge and bringing together criminologists internationally?
Okay, first of all, thank you for this wonderful introduction and so on. So, I started in criminology in the mid-70s and so on, and the first focus of my studies were ecology. I did large studies on particularly violence, urban ecology and so on, so that was a major focus. I spent, I think, years in police cellars coding police records. I think I personally coded between 7 and 9,000, I can't remember, police files. But the focus was on trying to find out the situation in terms of that, looking at who was assaulting whom, in what kind of circumstances, and also the ecology whereabout in various cities that was living. So that was sort of my first encounter with criminology. After a while I became also interested in individual differences. So I started to work. There was a huge longitudinal study in Stockholm called Project Metropolitan that followed 15,000 young people. So I did some work on that particular. So that's my first major research points. And I think, as you were alluding to integration, that this was the starting of thinking, okay, we have this ecological tradition and we had this individual development tradition, but really they did not work together. It was almost like two tribes, people who work in ecology and people who worked in and it was very difficult to find theories that bridge the two and so on. So I guess my interest in integration started with these kind of experiences.
During that time, I believe you had some experience with other international criminologists. So you were, am I correct that you were working with Ralph Lober on the Pittsburgh studies? You had experience with that. David Farrington doing cross-national research. So this is all feeding into your thinking and development of your plan. Yeah,
that was very important. I mean, I was lucky enough to work with some of the best people in the field and so on, and which is really good when you're a young scholar, because you can learn a lot and so on. So I think with the Pittsburgh study, I was working with ecology, trying to, I mean, that's a fantastic study, and it actually studied that we had modeled our study, we'll perhaps talk about later from that, but they lacked an ecological component. So that was something that I tried to contribute to that one. And with David, I did some cross-national comparison, comparing his Cambridge study with data from the Project Metropolitan study. So yeah.
And at that time, you were also working with the Swedish Crime Prevention Council, and that was where you set up some international conferences and journals. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was I spent the first 10 years at the University of Stockholm basically doing research, and then I was asked to take up a job at the Swedish National Crime Prevention Council. And here the focus was still a lot of ecology. We did a lot of research in something called the Stockholm Project, which included an intense study of 8 neighborhoods in Stockholm. But we also did a lot of pilot projects trying to develop localized crime prevention and so on, in a sense. So I think we built a quite strong research unit. And we also tried, given that Sweden is a small country, the main strategy I had was to try to get a lot of collaborations internationally. We arranged several conferences, we invited people. We did one on the integration of individual and ecological aspects, which came out in a book which I co-authored with David Farrington, Rob Sampson. Then we did one on integrating crime prevention strategies, which Ron Clark and Hugh McCord was the other editors and so. So we tried to capitalize on building international links. Also started a journal, which was called, I think it was called Studies in Crime and Crime Prevention in the English journal. And that also survived for some time, and then it was, I think, amalgamated into with another journal called Scandinavian Studies, and they became one, and I can't even remember what it's called now, but there is one journal for that. So it was a lot of activity, and I think this is important because the first 10 years just spending doing research, but this also gave focus on the practical utility of research, and so on, by working with a lot with practitioners and so on. And that's something I have been continued with basically ever since always trying to do fundamental research, but also work with policy and practice implications.
We'll come back to that towards the end as well. So I'm just curious, with you talking now about bringing those international players together, you moved from Sweden to the UK around 2000, a few years before that, and so 97.
Yeah.
So that's, I'm thinking about the initiation of the ESC, the European Society of Criminology, which would have been somewhere around in that time frame. How does that fit in to the work that you were doing already in Sweden, bringing together people? What was your role and your experience of that?
Well, the European Society, I mean, I was always very interested in the creation of such a society. I remember somewhere in the mid-90s, Jussin Jungertas was on a meeting in Stockholm and we discussed this, and then as you know, things happened and slowly, and then I moved to Cambridge, and then also talked with Michael Toner about this, and then a lot of people, and then eventually we had a meeting or several meetings, and then it emerged and so on. And I think it's really important to have a European society, and one reason I thought at that point is that all countries in Europe had their own criminological society. So there was a Scandinavian, a British, etc., and so on. But they were all pretty small and didn't have much interaction and so on. And there's a lot of good criminology going on in Europe, but wasn't really showcased well. So I thought a European society would be excellent for that particular reason.
Okay, so as I mentioned, this is around the time period then that you're moving to Cambridge and to the Institute of Criminology where you're now located. Again, as I try to make sense of the story here, I see that period as a time where all of this knowledge that you're bringing together, the interdisciplinary knowledge, the intradisciplinary knowledge, and the knowledge from all of those international players is coming together into an integration of the key insights. And one of the things that your writing really highlights is the integration of the individual and the environmental perspectives. You just mentioned about having put together conferences that are looking at that. So in this period of time, you were at the beginning of developing your situational action theory, which is the key theory that guides your research at the moment. And also then you undertook the first test of that, which also developed some of the key methodologies that you use. So can you tell us about that period, about the development of the situational action theory and also the
I think there was a kind of, or I felt some kind of frustration working with sort of individual differences in development and ecology, that there were really no good theory that could bridge the personal environment. So initially I tried to see, okay, which others have done combined routine activities, social disorganization with individual level theories and so on. But I felt it didn't work really well. So it was first when I spent some time at the Stanford Center, I became interested in and familiar with action theory. And then it sort of, at least for me, clicked in the sense that action theory is probably the vehicle to integrate person and environment. And the reason is that if you really understand what things move people to act in one way or another, you can then start to ask questions, okay, what kind of individual differences, what kind of individual development is important for people's crime involvement? What environmental aspects are important? Because as you know, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of various factors and correlates in crime, and most of them obviously are just markers and symptoms and so. So really, this I find this a good starting point for trying to assess these kind of things.
And so that led into the development of the situational action theory as a framework for trying to put that information together. there's been interesting discussion of this theory. It's received a lot of attention, especially from European criminologists, not just the theory itself, but also theory testing and looking for support, which has been very exciting, obviously, for those of us who are working with that particular theory. But there are those out there who have suggested that it isn't different than some theories like the control theories or routine or rational choice theory or routine activity theory. So how would you try to explain
I think that's quite good, because people say that this is a control theory, this is a routine theory, this is which is really good, because then I think it's a good indication that the purpose is accomplished. That one actually, and that was one of the aims, to integrate key insights from all these various theories. But again, the vehicle was the action theory, and most criminological theories do not really have a good action theory in a sense, or some alludes and so. So by doing that, and also capitalizing by findings more broadly from social and behavior science, I think this was sort of a good way to actually get it together. And then we moved on, as I think you were alluding to that. Okay, a theory is a theory, but you also need to test the theory, because I mean there's a lot of theory. I mean, one of the problems, I guess, with disciplines like criminology is we have so many theories, and textbooks are a cookbook, as if you could choose any theory you like, rather. So the important thing is, and I'm obviously not the only one who has pointed this out, it's really to testing. So that led to starting to do research programs that was specifically designed to test, and to do that you need to have money. I remember the first grant we got was a small grant from the Home Office. We did just a cross-sectional study in Peterborough, but the main, I think, good thing with that study was it enabled us to develop what we later have used quite a lot, so space-time budget methodology, which means that you follow people hour for hour, so you really can tie the person to the environment and to their actions, and so on. This was a test period. And then later we were lucky to get bigger grants, because if I remember correctly, we got a big grant for something called Scopic. And the idea with Scopic was to bring together some of the leading researchers in ecology and individual development, but not only, as we've done before, have conferences and discussions, but also actually do research. So that was the first funding of our study, which you have been involved in, the PADS Plus study, but also Tony Bottom's Sheffield study. And we also contributed some money to add on, I think, an ecological aspect to Tammy Moffat's twin study in London. So we moved from just sort of being theoretical and trying to integrate, also to trying to transform it into research. So that was, the next step.
Yeah, so that leads me straight into the next period of time, which is the time when you were developing, in particular, the Peterborough Adolescent and Young Adult Development Study, PADS Plus, which you mentioned there was one of these 4 studies in that initial Scopic network, social context of pathways in crime. I believe that's just work, if I can remember correctly. So in that time, this is really through PADS Plus, which is of course an ongoing longitudinal study. It's been carrying on since the original wave in 2003 with the parents, and then I joined the study in 2004 when the young people were first interviewed, so for quite many years. One of the things that I, working with this study myself, find really fascinating, and is an element of the integration, is that the first steps were looking at the situational process. You talked about action theories, so being able to look at people and environments interacting in a moment of action. But then with the longitudinal study, you were able to integrate that experience you had, which you've already mentioned longitudinally, for example with the Pittsburgh study, with this situational model as well, to then address developmental processes and combine this ecological approach in a longitudinal frame. Can you say something about the contribution that that makes. You've mentioned about gaps that are missing in phrenological knowledge. How
Well,
are you feeling?
I think, I mean, people can differ in what they think are important and not important, but again, I think developing this, the framework, and also trying to develop a methodology that we actually can test the framework has been quite a useful combination. And so far, I think the most of the tests we have done has been very supportive with kind of the situational model, ecology of crime. I mean, it's easy with this model to explain hotspots, changes over time, which, as you know, we currently finish a book on, working on. So that's quite a lot of different things.
One of the methodologies, you mentioned the space-time budget, which is a very important advance to be able to measure people's actual exposure in their activity spaces. Now within PADS Plus, unlike the original Peter Brady's study, that's combined with a community survey as well. So you have this really specific and unique measures of the social ecology of the city of Peterborough, where the young people are being mapped out and can link that in. I'm thinking about the scope of that project. So you've got the space-time budget to actually map where people are going. You've got a community survey to look at the areas that they're spending time in, which you can map by the space-time budget. Then obviously you have the individual level variables, which you mentioned about the influence of the Pittsburgh Youth Study. I know a lot of that has come from there to be able to measure those young people. There's also, I know, other elements that I've been involved in, the neuropsychological and cognitive tasks, and then even genetics. What are the challenges that you encountered, that your research team encountered along the way? Is there anything in particular that?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, no research is perfect. So it's a lifelong project to try to make it better and better, and that's what we're working for, try to add. So I guess the two elements to that. One element is you need to find financing, because to do good research costs money, and so on. And secondly, also to find out ideas how you actually do this and so on, which is not always possible in social sciences. But what we try to do is to combine, and I think a lot of you were talking about the space-time budget methodology and so on, was actually inspired of the early Chicago school. They were very basic in the research. They looked at variations often in official statistics and so on, but a lot of the reasoning and so on, the problems are okay. So if you have neighborhoods and so on, we know, for instance, that people who live in the same neighborhood can live very different lives, but it's very difficult to capture that, and that could explain. But with methodology like the space-time budget, we can actually study how people actually in the same house live their lives and what consequences that have for it. And again, I think it's important, but I guess there's some resistance to talk about these old tribes of, I guess, more sociological and more psychologically oriented, to actually bring this together, because I think there has been a lot of unnecessary competition and conflict, and really to move our understanding of these problems. It's the bringing of the insights together in an effective way. But that's a huge project, and I think we are only in the starting points of doing that.
One of the real strengths of the PADS Plus study, which is evidenced by the publications that have come out from the study itself, but also by the number of studies that are now replicating the methodology really effectively, is the quality of the data. We've talked about the space-time budget and the fact that we can actually map movements and incredibly detailed data about exposure. And just as you mentioned, we can actually try to then distinguish how people who live in the same neighborhood actually differ from each other in their exposure and how they respond to that exposure. But one of the things I know that comes up a lot in descriptions of the study is, for example, the high retention rate, and the fact that we're able to get as large a sample in the community survey as possible. What are your insights into having that kind of success?
As I said, having had the benefit in working with Rolf Lauber and the Pittsburgh Youth Study, which is an extremely well organized and run study. So when we started the PALS Plus study, we sent the person who was then the research manager over to Pittsburgh to study actually how they do it and so on, and we learned a lot how to make people want to take part in the study, how you keep people, and the various techniques, which is really important, because obviously if you have a longitudinal study and if you lose people, and most longitudinal studies do that, that could affect the findings over time. And particularly, I think we have been good on keeping people who are heavily involved in crime, which is often the people that is you lose a lot, and so that is particularly I think good point with the PALS Plus study.
It's 92% retention rate over 16 years of study, so it's very, very impressive. Okay, so then moving on from specifically the PALS Plus study, the next phase is really where you are now in your research. Obviously the PALS Plus study is ongoing. The young people within that study are now entering young adulthood, so it's interesting to think about what the new aspects that you'll be looking at are. But also within this time period you've been very active in building up this network of international researchers who are also studying the situational action theory and testing it within different national and international contexts. And then the other aspect at the moment that you're developing is implications for explaining and preventing crime from these various studies, and of course from the main bulk of the PALS Plus study. So can you say something a little bit about the inspiration or the nature of that work, both across national
well, it
relationships?
It is. We have built, and we basically, which is I think when we are in the European society, we have really, I think, built a strong network with European colleagues and so on. So we, over the last 6-7 years, we have run workshops in Cambridge where we brought together people who are interested in issues like this and develop research and try to foster collaborations, cross-national comparisons and so on, and I know you and others are now involved in the project to try to assemble all these data sets, because I think we have data sets from everything from China to Latin America to Europe, of course, and that's really interesting, because if you want to test the generality of theory, cross-national research is very important, and it's very rare, I think, with cross-national research that use the same methodology and so on in various, so that's a quite important future part. When it comes to prevention, we obviously have worked some with the Home Office, with other kinds of this, when it comes to our findings, but we also have a localized projects. We have one project in Denmark we've been involved with for a number of years. We try to transform this kind of findings into something practical, use particularly long-term prevention and so on, and how you build that. Because a lot of prevention, when you look at localized prevention, is focused on situational, here and now, policing, situational and so on. But what some people call social prevention or developmental prevention, or how do you actually manage that, has been less well catered for, I think.
So that is looking at now the evolution or your experiences across your life course with criminology. What are your observations or insights in thinking about how criminology has changed from when you first entered the discipline to where we are now?
Well, one thing is the expansion. It's enormously, I mean, when I started it was one criminology department in Sweden. I don't know how many there are, 15, 20 or something. They have same, so they same in the UK, a lot of expansion. And unfortunately, I think on the downside, there are less focus now on more fundamental questions. The ones we try to do, sort of basic questions of crime causation and so on, which I think is important for all things policy and so on, because if you clearly know, have good ideas why people commit crimes, what role people and environments play and so on, it's important not only for how you view the crimes but the people, but also for how you design the best possible preventions. So there's a lot of criminal justice focus now in criminology, which is fine in itself, but I think the balance could be better and so on, that perhaps and you can see that as if you go to conferences like the ESC and also the AEC, that a lot of the topics are around prisons, policing, criminal justice topics and so on, less sort of on more fundamental, and that I think would be good to strengthen that part of, but that's obviously my highly personal view.
Okay, so what do you see then for yourself moving forward in criminology?
You mean retiring soon? Yeah. So no, I think I mean I hope that the study can continue, because there are very few studies actually in the UK. I think there are only 2 modern longitudinal studies. It's ours and the Edinburgh project, and the England Wales is only 1. Then we have David's study, who has been, but that's from 1953 cohort. So to continue the study, and people like yourself and the other people in our team, that you will take it on and continue, because that, if you observe, that has been a problem with a lot of longitudinal research, that when the person originally started it retire or stop, then the study also dies. And as you know, it takes enormous effort and time to do longitudinal. I think it's going to be more and more difficult to get people to participate, so the value might even be higher. So that's, I think is one important thing for the future.
Yeah, that makes me think of some of the challenges in the future. From our experience, as you just alluded to, doing the kind of longitudinal, long-term research that we do is becoming perhaps more and more difficult because of the funding resources, as well as some of the changes in how people approach research. And I'm thinking in the terms of participation in research as much as researchers themselves. And yet there's this great potential with the technology that we now have available to us to make research much easier on a large scale, and to make research methods and data collection much more smooth and potentially even more
you can think about the space-time budget. I mean the first one we did was only sort of paper and pen and very manual. I mean you could do a lot with modern technology now and study people's movements, patterns and so on. So that's, and also in terms of experiments with virtual reality and so on, and testing sort of situational theories. I think there's a lot of interesting things to happen. I guess you asked about sort of the criminology thing. One thing that I think is a bit worrying, and people will disagree on this, is the tendency to mix up politics and activism with research and so on. Nothing wrong with politics, nothing wrong with activism, but I think it's a problem when these get too much mixed, and in a sense, and that's something which I personally think is clear, that's important to keep.
I think that speaks back to what you were saying about the need for more fundamental research within criminology, and the focus on that scientific endeavor to understand more about the phenomenon of crime itself, that we can then take as a strong foundation moving forward to actually inform prevention based on their actual
I
understanding.
think it's important that we as researchers, our job, I mean, if I guess politics is about how we would like things to be, the research is more about trying to find out how things are, and that's really important that the two sort of interchange but not sort of collude each other. So I think, but I know there's a lot of different views on this point, but I really think it's important not to do this.
Well, I think clear evidence for the need of that is the fact that we haven't come up with an effective explanation of crime, we haven't come up with effective ways to deal with crime or with those people who have become involved in it. So until we are able to actually create effective explanations and effective methods, prevention, criminal justice procedures and so on, then we obviously don't have those answers. So we need to keep looking and we need to keep asking those questions.
But I guess it's a bit more problematic because you also have the issue what is crime and what and so on, because but that would be a long discussion because in a sense you have to differentiate why people do crime and why certain things are crime, and people might highly disagree and people do disagree about that, but that's a whole other issue.
It's quite fascinating to be in a discipline that's still from the inception of it to today, asking questions about what it is that we study. All right, so I mean, those are my main questions and things of interest. I thought I might summarize perhaps where we've come through the interview. So as I said at the very beginning, and as we've emphasized throughout, I've been very interested in how you have been an integrative force within criminology, and how integration has been at the core of what you have done throughout your very extensive and successful life as a criminologist. So that's included the integration of both interdisciplinary knowledge, so knowledge from outside of the field of criminology, as well as interdisciplinary knowledge inside, looking at, as we mentioned, those split parts of the discipline that we're looking at environmental and individual information separately. You've also integrated key insights then from this body of knowledge that you worked to bring together. So that's looking at both knowledge from theories and trying to integrate the key insights from theories, also methodologically, key insights from methods, how do we study people, but how do we study environments, and as you mentioned with the space and budget in particular, how do we actually place people in environments so we aren't just using a proxy environment, but we actually can try to measure the true environments that they're in, which is a fascinating innovation.
I think you're saying that because sometimes people think about criminology and will come across that as this is social policy and a sort of second-rate discipline and so on. But I actually think that there are very many good prospects for criminology. First of all, it is or should inherently be multidisciplinary, because people come from a lot of different to bring together. It really addresses fundamental questions in society, like problems of social order and so on. So it is in one sense a very fundamental knowledge base and so on. So I think that's important to keep in mind when I think about criminology and its prospects. It's actually the rules we have in society, why people follow and break rules, how people come to encompass certain rules and so on, is all basic and classic problems of social and behavioral sciences and bridging. I actually think the concept of rules, if you look, you can find that in neurosciences, we have basic rule-following people. You can find it in social psychology, interest in rules. You can find it in sociology and so on. So there is a good scope for bringing all this interesting knowledge together within the realm of criminology, I think.
And that's something that I think a lot of your work speaks to. It speaks to the fact that we have this great body of knowledge within criminology and that we can draw on from other behavioral sciences, but there's a fragmentation there. And so from your publications, and also as we've spoken here, you have seen that as a key thing that needed to be addressed, that this fragmentation needed to be addressed through this integration, through integrating the knowledge that we have and drawing upon it. In particular, I mentioned theory of methods, but also findings, the empirical evidence that we have, and evidence-based foundation for then, as we've said, building forward to explain crime and then being able to have that foundation for crime prevention practices.
Yeah, but the problem is that people by training, I mean, a lot of people do criminology come from biology, psychology, social psychology, sociology, political sciences, and have their particular training and then focus on that, all producing interesting insights, but not really integrating them. And so on. So that's really what I think would be sort of the next fantastic step, if criminology can move more to integrate and use and capitalize on all these various strands and thinking and so on. But we'll see what's happened in the years to come.
So the other step then, that is a theme that we've had coming out here in the interview, and again we see through your work, is bringing together not just that knowledge, but the people who are producing it, as well as the methods that they've developed in order to produce it. So with your international network then, criminologists and your influence in trying to help create these networks like the European Society of Criminology, and seeing that was certainly a way forward, then that brings together all of those skills and all of those unique perspectives that all the different individuals have, and with that ability to try to shape it into something that's not so fragmented, then
in a sense we need the sort of a common knowledge, so people can communicate over disciplinary boundaries, so not get stuck in, because there are many concepts that are similar in sociology, psychology and so on, but they are different, but they capture similar things, and so on. So that's
Well, I think my ultimate conclusion of all that is I was very lucky to be able to, as I said before, be in the right place at the right time, so that my interdisciplinary knowledge, which is not criminological, could find a place within the discipline. And then for myself within the project, I spent 10 years learning about the social ecology of crime, which then I could integrate with my knowledge of the individual. And that was something I couldn't find footing within my introduction to criminology apart from working with you on the Paths Towards project. So that's been hugely beneficial to me, and hopefully it will be to others who've also been able to benefit from that.